It is 6 p.m. on Tuesday, the 5th of April, and we are live. How are you doing? And a warm welcome back to another edition of EDEXCEL A-Level Geography Revision. We're ready to go with another part of the globalisation spec this evening, which is contained within the advanced information for the 2022 cohort. It is 3.2 on the globalisation part of the specification, and its political and economic decision making are important factors in the acceleration of globalisation. You'll remember 3.1 that we looked at last session was looking more at the accelerating factors. And there was a wide range of points that we covered. Do have a look back if you missed that session. But what are we going to look at today? And it's important to note that I will upload the slides in the bio after. So do feel free to access these slides, copy and paste, take notes, do whatever you wish to do with them. But it is important to note that in this session, I'm going to be giving you the heads up on the type of things you should be studying, you should be looking at, you should be investigating further ahead of the summer exams. This revision session alone, you'll need to build on these points that we're looking at afterwards. So it's 3.2, political and economic decision making are important factors in the acceleration of globalisation. We're going to look at A, B and C this evening. You will notice the bold aspects of this particular point, and you'll see the letter P next to it. Now, if you're not familiar with that, that effectively means that we are discussing, one of the concepts that runs throughout the specification, that is the idea of players. In all of your essays, you should be trying to bring in these key synoptic themes, and players are highlighted a number of times in A, B, and C. WTO, IMF, World Bank, we need to know about them. And remember, for those doing 2022, this is contained within the advanced information, meaning it will be assessed. So it's really important that you do look at what's in bold here, make sure you understand those organizations very well. B, national governments are key players in terms of promoting free trade blocs, the role of the European Union and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. Already within A and B, we've got international political and economic organizations, we've got national governments and trade blocs, European Union, ASEAN. And then finally at the bottom, the role of governments in attracting FDI. So we have quite clear, bold players across A, B, and C with the generic 3.2 theme of political and economic decision making are important factors in accelerating globalization. I almost think 3.2 on the left there can be phrased in a slightly different way to form a question of which you may need to offer an evaluative point on our international political and economic organizations, national governments, trade blocs. Are they the main accelerating factors? Which of the organizations is important? So it's really important that this section lends itself very well to either a source-based 12-mark question, or indeed they could take a section of it and ask you a much smaller 4-mark question. Either way, we know it's going to be assessed in the 2022 cohort. So let's really work at this and make sure that we know A, B, and C very, very well. Remember, feel free to use the chat function at any point. For those just joining us, we are doing paper 2, globalization. It's 16 marks in your exam. Okay, moving on. Let's start off with the endpoint. And I'm going to bring up another important, if you were doing a 12 marker on this, let's say. One of the key themes running through the course again is futures and uncertainties. There's a great number of points that are quite useful for making an evaluative or some form of assessment and judgment on the role that these organizations are playing in accelerating globalization. Could the influence that any of those organizations back here, WTO, IMF, World Bank, ASEAN, EU, governments, can any of these factors or things that might happen in the future change the role that these organizations play? It's really good kind of sense of assessment that, maybe at the end you'll say this is where we're at the moment with these organizations. This is how important they are. But Could we have another financial crisis like we did in 2008, 2009? Could that change the influence that certain international economic organizations might have? What about alternatives to the World Bank? China Development Bank, as an example, New Development Bank. Is there potential there for actually another economic organization to be playing a key role? China Development Bank, a really interesting one. We know the global shift has moved the center of gravity of our economy towards China. Could the influence of economic organizations based around China, or indeed any of our other emerging nations, play an important role in the future? We know there's disagreement and lack of satisfaction amongst WTO countries. I've put a little bit of a link to, which was from February of this year. So again, if you're looking for the wow factor, there's a good article there, which again, Bloomberg News, it's Biden also. Is he taking off where Trump, who had a tough stance on the WTO, is Biden picking up on that? Will the USA still have very much issues with the WTO? Look at that article, have a little look. There's another article there about WTO reform and countries wanting change, but we'll talk more about the WTO in a minute, so don't worry if you're a bit lost. And of course, let's think what's going on right now in the world. War, conflict on a regional European scale, but with global economic ramifications. Is there going to be change in the future when it comes to, and let's go back to the question, the political and economic decision-making are important factors in the acceleration of globalization. Could some of the political factors going on now lead to issues with globalization? There's also a good article out there at the moment. Is the Ukraine, if you just Google Ukraine, Russia, deglobalization, has the fact that the companies pulling out of Russia, and they are hundreds over the last 40 days or so, has that signaled deglobalization? And in fact, maybe that shows you the influence that TNCs have, going back to last lesson, rather than the economic and political organizations. So that's almost like we're jumping to the end, but it's worth thinking about that as we go through it. So when you're trying to ponder this particular section, why don't you think to yourself, why might governments restrict global trade? Why? What are they trying to do? Think what's happened in the recent conflict. Why are governments restricting global trade, particularly with certain countries? How do governments develop or encourage global trade? Now, these are questions you should have answers to, and we'll talk a little bit about SEZs later, which is a really important way that China was certainly able to encourage global trade. But let's look at some important factors that also influence trade. And I'm giving you questions here to go away and ponder, but tariffs play an important part, which is fees that are paid on imported goods. If governments increase tariffs, how will that affect trade? If governments lower tariffs, how does that affect trade? It absolutely restricts the areas of the world or the countries that you may well end up trading with. Quotas, restrictions on the number of goods imported into a country. Again, if countries increase quotas, how does that affect trade? Or if they decrease them, how does that affect trade? Make sure you're aware about the role that governments imposing restrictions can have on others. Subsidies, grants given to domestic industries to help them compete with foreign producers. Many of us will be aware of subsidies, particularly for agricultural products, whether that be in the UK or in countries like New Zealand, often are useful for countries to try and protect their domestic industries. But again, make sure you're aware why countries might do this. So let's take this spec point and think carefully about the work of international organizations, getting more deep into the spec point here. Now, as I said, the players that you're asked to look into in a bit of depth is most certainly the WTO, the IMF, and the World Bank. You need to know these Bretton Woods institutions incredibly well. Now, as I said in our last session, please feel free at any point to either pause the video, and you can extract notes that you need in order to help you move forward, or indeed, you can go to my slides that I'll put below, and hopefully that will help. So will the Bretton Woods players maintain their influence? several things that you should be exploring. Think about the global financial crisis, as I've already mentioned. Will governments be more sceptical moving forward now on advice from the IMF and the World Bank? And MIS, for those who study MIS, we talked a little bit about issues linked to that as well in recent weeks. We discussed Jamaica, if you remember. For those who don't do MIS, it is worth looking into the role of Jamaica and think about SAP's structural adjustment policies, although not directly in this point we're talking about now, but just interesting. WTO's continuing lack of success, 159 members to reach a global agreement on trade in relation to things like food is becoming very difficult. And again, I've put a lot of text in here just so that you can pause and indeed get the notes on the work of international organizations. Bringing it back to the spec point, really important then. What do you need to know? Understand the role that IMF, World Bank, and WTO play. Right? They are key players identified in the spec. They're in bold. You can see all three of them there. Again, feel free to pause at any point, extract what you need, but be able to evaluate that role that they play. Now, this is taken from one of the textbooks, but is a useful revision resource. IMF rules and regulations are controversial. Strict financial conditions imposed on borrowing governments. I've discussed this with my group a number of times. The cutbacks on things like health, education, sanitation, and housing, the key areas that countries need to be investing in. IMF imposes those strict regulations and rules. Make sure that you're aware. That's a really important evaluative point if you're asked to assess the role that they play. In many ways, they cause countries problems by restricting their ability to spend on key social aspects of the running of the country. Like the IMF, the World Bank also imposes very strict conditions on loans and grants. And interestingly enough, the World Bank has a huge connection with America. The presidents coming from America, the role that America plays, then maybe that takes us into superpowers, a synoptic connection. Who's controlling these organizations? Who has influence over what players in terms of the World Bank, IMF, WTO? Which countries are influencing these key players? Good synoptic link there. The WTO, again, it's not managed to agree trade rules that have restricted the most developed countries from being able to subsidize their own products. Again, what does such protectionist policies do? It harms other low-income countries, meaning that it's very hard for them to trade on a level playing field. So there we go. There's three assessments of the roles of these three main players that we are asked to look at. Learn their role, learn the positives and negatives as we just discussed. That's going to be useful in your exams this summer, 2022. So let's just highlight that, really important, very important. Learn these players, learn these key players. Really, really useful. Okay, apologies for the slight issue here with the formatting, but the spec point is at the top overlaid. National governments are key players in the promotion of free trade, but who else are important? The role of the European Union, ASEAN, for a number of things that we need to understand. Market liberalisation, privatisation, and encouraging business startups. The role of governments in economic liberalisation, which we'll talk about in a second in more depth. But understand your trade blocks. What are they? Why do they exist? What's their purpose? What are the advantages, disadvantages? And be able to give us an idea of who is in the trade blocks. The ones that the spec's asking us to look at, EU and ASEAN, there is some basic notes for you. It might be worth, and some key dates. There's a bit of a timeline. Know your timeline. Know the changes. And we always talk about across this course a number of times, 2004 being a real key date. But 2016, the decision for the UK to leave, really important. But the freedom of movement is a really interesting point to think about. Generally speaking, in terms of how much control the governments have over over their own borders if we have people coming in and going as they please, which was again one of the leave arguments, wasn't it? But make sure you understand the role that these players play. ASEAN on the other side, again, trying to eliminate tariffs, trying to promote free trade. I mentioned Indonesia later as a good example because ASEAN's credited with allowing Indonesia to thrive in terms of manufacturing. And we all know about the Philippines as well, becoming very, very well known for its call center services. So lots to think about there in terms of the countries that ASEAN's helped and influenced, but also the wider promotion of peace and stability that a trade bloc offers. As I've just said, make sure you understand the EU and what it allows EU countries to get, whether that be EU laws to protect the environment. Again, good synoptic link to climate change there. Does it allow you to live, work, and study across the European Union? Who does that benefit? Does that help drive certain economies more than others? Just important to understand the role that it plays in accelerating globalization. Does it make Europe more united, or do European countries actually maintain their very separate cultures? Worth thinking about the cultural role as well that these bodies play. Little exam style question there for you. If you just wanted to pause the video again and just practice a format question, I've gave you some ideas. Explain why countries join trade blocs such as the EU and ASEAN. I've put some points there, basically repeating what I've just discussed in the previous slide. But again, feel free to pause, or indeed, if you look at the slides, have a little look. The trade, the idea of free trade blocs is important, and we just looked through that there. But what about the policies that often these key players are putting in place? National governments play a key role in this, and national governments play a key role in globalisation, which, going back to last session, also helps TNCs grow in terms of their size or their influence. Government policies could include free market liberalisation. Now, what do we mean by that? We'll think back to Thatcher in the UK during the 1980s. Few simple beliefs that I put down here. Again, it's nice note form for you to pause and have a look. Government intervention in markets impedes economic development, 1. And 2, overall wealth increases, trickles down from the richest to the poorest. In practice, moving or taking restrictions away from companies and so on. And many of us will be aware of the deregulation of the City of London in the mid-80s. And actually that led to, and I was talking about this with one of the other groups recently, a lot of migration and a real push for financial services in the 80s, late 80s in London onwards, which allowed it to become that world hub of financial services that we know today. Privatisation, another interesting one where basically UK governments have allowed foreign investors to gain stakes in privatised national services and infrastructure, energy, railway, which is interesting because those are often considered important assets. And as you'll know, with the ongoing issues linked to energy at the moment, that's an interesting one to keep your eye out. And if anything else happens with energy over the next few weeks, it could be something useful to put into your exam. Encouraging business startups. Now, this is another one where often businesses, national governments can offer low business taxes or other incentives in order to attract investors from other countries, which might often help. And we'll talk a little bit more about China later on too. But those are just 3 important things we can think about linked to economic liberalisation. I just mentioned those 3 points there, and there's a kind of timeline of national government views in terms of Thatcherism in the 80s into the early 90s, and that backs up what we were just talking about there. If we go back to the slide here, then national governments have certainly adopted a number of these policies, and we can go to the UK and say, yeah, Thatcherism. It believed in exactly that. And you can use the textbook if you want more on this, but remember, important to develop your notes without being too historical, because if you're doing a peel paragraph on a 12 marker, there's only so much historical background would ever be needed, if any more than just a point, as in a figure. FDI mentioned in the spec is something else that's very important. Again, there are a number of different types of foreign direct investment, which we've learned in the lesson back in lower 6, or indeed, if you're not from Headington at the moment, then maybe you have looked at this. It's also in your textbook. So make sure you understand the different types of foreign direct investment. But importantly, I would also understand what makes a country attractive to investors. Wage rates. Go think back to the other parts of globalization and the global shift. Wage rates was one of the key reasons for the global shift. It was cheaper employment for many of the factories that wanted to set up. Labour skills, size of the economy, political stability is a real big factor in whether countries can attract foreign direct investment. Raw materials, again, it speaks for itself, and you could think of Chinese investment in Africa, and there is a fantastic resource out there where you can see all the various countries where that investment is taking place. Also interesting is the idea of climate and whether a country is landlocked or not. So physical location, going back to physical geography and the role that can play in globalization and indeed FDI. Remember, let's bring up some key concepts. Important to be thinking key concepts that run throughout the course. And the idea that if we can have investment in the form of FDI, we have this multiplier effect in the idea that wealth can be concentrated in certain places, and then it can spill out and eventually increase the development of other parts of the country and much more. Again, do feel free to pause. Apologies for the text-heavy nature of this, but it's because I want to really feed your notes and help you with this. If we look at the part C here, attitudes to FDI. I introduced FDI there, but the spec's very clear. In brackets, China's 1978 open door policy contributed to the spread of globalization into new regions. So there's two examples for you. We know that an important reason for the acceleration of globalization was TNCs and indeed governments changing attitudes towards investing outside of Europe and North America. More confidence came about. And Asia's 3 most populated countries, China, India, and Indonesia, all embraced this idea of engaging with the global market in order to meet their own development needs. And the establishment of SEZs, incredibly important. I'll come and talk more about them in a minute as a good example. Government subsidies and indeed changing attitudes to FDI. Indonesia and India, I've used as 2 examples down here that comes from one of the revision guides. Feel free indeed to extract some notes on countries where certainly changing attitudes have allowed governments to attract further investment, and at quite a successful rate. What is a special economic zone then? I'm talking about a term there that we've not discussed. Basically, an industrial zone, often near a coastline, where favourable conditions, think of some of those conditions I mentioned a few slides back. Why are some areas more prone to FDI than others? Wages, the physical geography, and many other factors that I mentioned. But then there is the incentives, the low tax rates, exemptions from tariffs. We talked about them at the very start of the session, and export duties too. Effectively, it's like a zone that has different regulations than other regions in the country. That's what a special economic zone is essentially. And here's just a map that shows you the special economic zones in China. You can see them numbered. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, where do we find them? Near to the coast. and we can see them numbered here: 1, 2, 3, 4. And interesting to note that these zones now are where we are finding huge numbers of population growth, and have over the last 20, 30 years, and a number of cities popping up, many of which you may well not have heard of. But it shows you just the rapid pace of change that these SEZs have initiated in these regions. What about India? I mentioned India there. Why do people want to invest FDI in India? Well, there's a number of reasons, and if you're in my lessons last year, you would have probably come across these slides before. So feel free to again pause, extract from your notes. But FDI, in terms of India, there was a huge, wide range of reasons why it was such an attractive proposition for many TNCs, and many of the issues are there. Entrepreneurship, high tech, stable currency, emerging market, a large emerging market, politically stable, positive image globally. You know, the Indian Premier League, if you're into cricket, Bollywood, and many of you will have watched a number of Hollywood movies that are based out of India. Government backing, government really supporting TNCs, English speaking, another important one, and indeed an improving infrastructure. So a wide range of reasons why FDI and government looked to attract it. China, I mentioned earlier there, and we were looking at the map. But again, lots of reasons, and feel free to indeed pause this and extract. But tax incentives I mentioned through the setting up of SEZs. Cheap skilled labour I mentioned earlier as well, important. Think back to last session, containerization, the rise of containerization. So cheap freight was another reason. Emerging market, again, it's just huge. So the idea that your goods could be sold in the country means that there is a consumer base potentially for your images, or your products, sorry. Good infrastructure, rapidly developing infrastructure, huge government backing, and political stability. And again, we know that that's certainly an attractive proposition for those wanting to invest. But certainly the reason for the global shift, and the reason that huge amount of FDI piled into all the SEZs was certainly linked to the idea of cheap skilled labour, which we've looked at in other parts of the course too. Again, feel free to pause. I've put some extra detailed notes in here, which just backs up what we've been saying. But certainly it's important to know that the special economic zones, from 1978, the decision was made. 1980, they were put into practice. And from then on in, Chinese economic policy had certainly shifted, encouraging and supporting foreign trade and investment. A huge turning point, which has actually led to the position we're in at the moment, which is China's huge economic fortune, and indeed its path to becoming the world's factory. As we know at the moment, China is incredibly important to the world's global economy, and indeed in terms of manufacturing and production. Think back to PPE during lockdown. I mentioned it last session, but there was big trouble because we were all potentially interdependent. Remember, interdependent, that idea of interdependence, is that playing a part here in why China wants this interaction? Does it make other parts of the world reliant on it? Which is quite an important idea, synoptic link, and indeed making us think about the future. Really important. So a few things just to back that up. When was it introduced? 78, with the kind of setting up in 1980. Low wage factories become the most important aspect. I'm kind of repeating myself, but again, important just to feel free to extract if you don't have good notes on this. Lots of reasons, and essentially the open door policy was to encourage foreign business, foreign trade in China. Really important because it's in the spec. So foreign direct investment, this is quite useful in terms of looking at the change and tracking the change over time. But certainly we can see by region, and you can see here the green showing you that rise of China to incredible, green being Asia, but an incredible rise. Absolutely incredible. So I hope that has helped give you it's quick run through, a quick 30-minute run through of A, B, and C. But as I've said, I've crammed a lot into a very quick space, quick amount of time. And I really think it's important for you to go back through this, pause, look at the slides if you wish, and really try and get your head around the players that are involved here and some of these really important key terms. Hope that's been some assistance last session and indeed today. It's quite quick. We've covered 3.1 and 3.2 in just over 1 hour and a half. So obviously there's a lot of work for you to do to just consolidate your thoughts on this. But I hope it's made you realize all the different areas and what you need to go away and indeed learn. Thank you very much, guys. Have a wonderful evening. I'll be back soon for another installment of EDEXCEL A-Level Geography live. From me, Miss Cunningham. Ciao. Goodbye.